Well, hello, my name is Scott Lancaster, and I am one of the research and instruction librarians here at Waters Library at A&M Commerce. And this workshop today that I'm going to go over, where do I begin writing a literature review for your dissertation or thesis proposal? I became aware a couple of years ago about how literature review workshops were something that people wanted and that were needed. And then I also kind of thought, there's actually two steps to it, and you actually may end up doing two different but related literature reviews in the beginning when you're doing the proposal and you're just discovering what there is about your topic or even what focus you want to take with your topic. And that will develop as you put it together. It may even change slightly. And then you have an expanded literature review that you're doing when you actually are writing your thesis or dissertation. And that's usually one of the beginning chapters. So this one is going to be focused mainly on what you would do in the beginning. And I'm also assuming that you all know the basics of research. We will, hopefully have time to look at the databases and searching, but I'm assuming that if you're at this level, you have had experience with them before. But if you have any questions, put them in the chat, or you can break in and ask them, or wait until the end and ask them. So I'm going to share my screen now. Well, okay. So you should see the slide that I've, because I can't move it. Oh. Sorry, I'm trying something new so I can have it where I'm looking at you when or looking at the camera. Okay, I'll just leave it here then. So everybody should see, where do I begin writing a literature review? And I guess Fatima, let me know if you can't see that. So just quickly to move through, what is a literature review? A literature review is a comprehensive survey of previous work in a specific area. And it should bring together different aspects of the literature in that area, draw attention to the most significant works, and create something new with it. And the objective of the literature review is, first of all, think about your reader, which is going to be, on a very small level, your advisor, the person who's guiding your thesis or dissertation. They are your main reader, but then there are the other people on your committee, and there's the kind of scholarly community as a whole. But what you're wanting to give them is the knowledge that they need to understand your research project. It's the groundwork that you lay so that your project is in context and makes sense. It's not an explanation of everything you know about a particular subject. And in the beginning, as you do your research, you may be pulling in everything just because you've got to acquaint yourself with it. But in the end, it's only the things that are necessary to understand your particular focus. And because of this distinction, you need to first perform a thorough investigation of the literature, and then you synthesize only the material relevant to your research question. And I want to point you to two articles that I found, and I'm not going to go over really the details of them, but you will get this slides. So if you want to look at them, you can. The first one is Cooper's Taxonomy of Literature Reviews. I found this cited in several papers about research, and it is something that has been kind of a standard since it was created in 1988 of how you can describe the parts of a literature review in terms of focus, goal, perspective, coverage, organization, and audience. And Cooper goes through the different details within each of these. And I think that this is really important if you are wanting to sort of understand how to write a literature review. The primary thing would be to look at literature reviews, especially ones that are about your topic and that have been supervised by your advisor before, and you find those in dissertations and theses in ProQuest. But this taxonomy is also a good resource to use in terms of understanding the components of a literature review. And the second article I wanted to point you to is a 2007 article by Kennedy, where he describes the types of literature reviews, because what you write in a literature review, how you put it together, will vary depending on your topic. And this article, which is an educational researcher, does a good job of describing 6 different types of literature reviews. So I think those are good resources that, again, I will send out to you to look at. What we're going to go over in the workshop is 6 steps of planning your literature review, which first involve defining your research question. And this is the same thing that you do when you do any research project. You have to figure out, what is it I want to find? What am I trying to answer? And when you have that research question, then you plan your approach to the research and your review. You write up, or you at least think of the steps you're going to follow. And then you actually go through the process of searching the literature, looking in the databases, or collecting information in whatever other way that they might be accessible to you. Then you analyze that material that you found. Then you manage the results, which I'll show you some library resources that you can use to do that. And then finally, you write your review. And actually, this whole process, especially the last 4 parts of it, are recursive. They go back, you'll go back and you'll redo things, and you'll do them again as you develop and get feedback on your project. So you will repeat some of these multiple times. In defining your research question, you don't want a research question that is so broad that it encompasses too many areas and can't be answered. And this, you work on this with your advisor, and you also work on it as you read through the literature and sort of hone it down to something that can actually be accomplished in what you're writing. And remember, the main focus of the thesis or dissertation is to graduate. It's not like to create necessarily your lifelong masterpiece. So the more you can narrow it down to something focused and accomplished, the more you're both going to create something that is valuable in the scholarly community, but also you're going to use your time well, and you're going to accomplish your goal of getting your degree. So you need to set appropriate limitations on the research that you're seeking. For instance, many disciplines, they want very recent, like the last 5 years. Some, it may be very broad. You can take, going back decades, if not centuries, but yet the subject is very specific. So that you'll want to focus your research question. And then you plan your approach. You will generate relevant keywords by identifying the main ideas or concepts in the question. And then you expand those by brainstorming terms or synonyms. And then you use those keywords to do your search of the databases, which we'll do in a minute. And remember that the research process is not a straight line. It folds back on itself. You discover new things and it leads you down alternate paths, or you go down a path that isn't working, so you have to backtrack and start again. You will often find that keywords you thought were going to be the best are not going to be the ones that the database uses, or the terms change over time, and what something was called 20 years ago is called something quite different now. In terms of searching, there will be two main things in our library that you will be searching in. The first one is the catalog, or the library catalog. It's the digital equivalent of the card catalog that many libraries used to have. And it is material that has been specifically chosen by librarians or other people at the university. Whether it's print or digital, it's been chosen item at a time to be added to the collection. It could be print, it could be something digital. That's the library catalog. But we also have the databases, which at the moment, I think we have over 330 databases. And these are subscription items that have been put together by various providers, information providers, and we get a subscription to them. And these will be where you get a lot of the peer-reviewed journal articles. And by and large, then you're going to be getting the full text of the articles. Just very briefly, we'll look at there's Boolean operators. You've created keywords and you put them together with the Boolean operators. Remember that when you use and between two keywords, you're making your results smaller, because in this case, you pull in all of the items in a database or catalog that have the word psychotherapy associated with it, and you pull in another grouping of everything that has eating disorder. But then what you want in your result list are only those items that have both. On the other hand, if you put or between two keywords, you make your results larger. And this is usually in the case of synonyms or different ways of terming the same idea. Less frequently, you will use the keyword not to take out something, so that you want articles about eating disorder, but you're not interested in articles that are about bulimia. You only get the ones that are about something other than bulimia. There are a few other search tools, and this is just 3 of them. The one I use most often is phrase searching, which you also can use in Google, where you put a term in quotation marks, and the results that you're going to get are going to be those words in that order. Really useful when you've got a specific term like I've got here in this example, where it's common words, but that each independently means something themselves. But when you put them together, in this case, it's a specific piece of legislation, No Child Left Behind. If we don't put it in quotation marks, then the database will treat your search as each one of them could be found separately and have nothing to do with what you want. I don't often use the truncation and wildcards, but they are very useful. With truncation, it's usually the question mark symbol and when you put it at the end or the beginning, or even in the middle, wherever it's at, you're looking for any letter or group of letters that could be replacing. So in this case, with child and a question mark, you come up with results that have the word child as well as a lot of variations of that, like childlike, childish, etc. And on the other hand, the wild card is where you have one letter in the middle of a word, and it can be replaced by any one letter. And this is useful, especially if you're doing searching where you might be coming up with things that have British spelling, and some words are spelled quite, slightly differently, like color and color. But phrase searching is by and large the one I think would be the most used. I'm hoping that some of you might have a suggestion for what we could search on today, but this is an example of a search that I did in one of the databases, and you'll see how using the different tools changed. When I first searched with social media and death, I get almost 2 million results. But when I put the quotation marks around social media, so I'm only getting that phrase, then I'm cut out a lot of things and I'm down to under 200,000 now. And then you can also narrow it down by date. And as you add other terms, your results become more and more focused and smaller, until you can see I've gone through this whole series until I've got down to 94. And this is usually the way that I will conduct a search. I will start out very broad in something that I know I'm going to get way, way too many results. But I just want to get an idea about what is out there, how many I'm going to get. And then I gradually try other terms, other words. I look through, I think with this digital afterlife, I added that as I looked through and I decided, oh, I want to do a different search and I want to add, I want to add that to my search. And so I go through sort of a step-by-step process. I don't usually immediately start out with with a search that has a lot of terms in it, because you may end up with 0 results. You've got way too many terms and it's too specific. So I like to begin with just having some idea about how big of a pool I'm talking about that I'm casting my net in. Finally, this is the last one. You'll need to manage your results. And this is really good to learn at the beginning of the research process as you're working on your proposal. When previously, like when I started, we used filing cabinets and manila folders. We Xeroxed things. We took handwritten notes. But as you're finding your things in a digital environment, you're also saving them and managing them in a digital environment. So you're either like saving them on a flash drive, or you are saving them in one of these online things like RefWorks or EndNoteWeb, or many of the databases have, you can set up a personal account and have, you can save things in the individual databases in a folder. I'm going to go now to the web page, to the library homepage. If you have any questions, you can bring them up now or put them in the chat, and we can do a search on your topics. Do you see the library homepage?
Yes, Scott.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to say that last week the library page changed, so it may look slightly different than what you've seen before. And I'll just kind of briefly explain that you'll find the links that used to be at the top of the page over here. And please, I want to point out the library survey that we just started this week. So any of you that have the time and want to sort of contribute to helping us improve the library, it just takes less than 5 minutes to do. Click on that link and go through the survey. But over here, it's a little bit misleading but you need to click on the downward arrow in order to, and this, I'm gonna have to make that a little bit bigger. Again, if you click on the downward arrow, you come up with the advanced search, journals, databases, and research guides. This is one search which will look in the library catalog as well as many of the databases that we can make work with it. Or you can go to any of the individual databases. A good one to start with would be either Academic Search Ultimate if you want an EBSCO interface, or ProQuest Central if you want a ProQuest interface. I want to show you about ProQuest Dissertation and Theses full text. If you click here, and if you're off campus, of course, you'd be logging in to the proxy. It is a really good idea as you're looking at writing a thesis or dissertation to look at theses or dissertations that have been done in the department that you're working in, or even hopefully by the advisor that you're working with. So again, this is looking at everybody's theses and dissertations. So first, we'll want to narrow down to just our university. I always put the word commerce, just to, and I click find, and it's gonna give me the one I want. And I can put in dates if I want, like we'll say just the last 5 years. And then I can look up advisors. And I will look for Carter. Oh, wait. So I'm looking for Shannon Carter. And what you'll find is that if you're looking for a specific person, their name may appear in different versions from one, because it's, you know, individual people writing these dissertations, and they might write the name differently in this. So I don't know if that first S. Carter was Dr. Carter. And in her case, there's just the one, but there might have been another one that was Shannon, middle initial Carter, or it could have been S, middle initial Carter. So I always kind of keep in mind that I'm looking for more than one version of a person's name. And then I can add the search. And I don't have to put anything up here. I can just click search, and I've got 4 results because there were 10, but we're looking at just the last 5 years. So in this case, if Dr. Carter was my advisor, I can look at the dissertations that she has been the advisor for. And that's very helpful, especially when I'm looking at the literature review too. I think it's a really good idea to look at not just even dissertations produced here, but dissertations written anywhere that cover that deal with something like yours, and then look at the way the literature review is put together to decide whether you want to how you want to put it together. Are there anybody have a topic that you're working with that you'd like me to look something up with, or give you my ideas about how I would proceed with it? Well, I'll show you how I would do a search. We're going to go into well, let's start with one search first. I'm going to look children and pandemic and mental health, because that's something that a lot of people have been, basically people have been doing a lot of research about pandemic and how it's affected various walks of life. So I've got 136,000 results here, way too many. But remember that this looks at both the catalog as well as the databases. And if I wanted books, which there probably are not going to be a lot of relevant books yet written about this, but if I did want books, I would go to resource types and pick books. However, I want peer-reviewed journals. So I click here and then go to apply filters. And I've got 26,000. And there's probably a lot that go back. See, this goes back to 1951, because this is not the first pandemic that has affected children. But I'm interested in this pandemic. So I'll do 2020 to 2022. And now I can look at in subject and find, might narrow down to one of these. I'll pick, in this case, psychology. And you can further narrow down as you want to. If you're not aware, you can create an account, and then as you put things in, you can, this is a database that has, this is using the ProQuest interface. And when you put things in the folder by clicking the TAC, then they're going to be up here when you click on the folder, but you've got to be signed in if you want to keep them. Oh, this is going to make me.
Scott,
Yes.
Angela does have a kind of research question in the chat box.
Okay.
And there is one question from Dr. Lee.
Okay, I'll look at that. So anyway, you'll see I've signed in here, and now these are other articles and dissertations and things that I had saved in the past. That is the example of how you can save your research. Let's see. Digital grammar checks. To Angela asks, application of digital grammar checks in freshman English courses. What is it that you mean?
I'm trying to find out if there's any research currently that's already been published that they used things like Grammarly, Hemingway, they allowed their freshman intro classes to use these prior to submitting papers. And did they see an improvement in the grades and progress of those
Oh,
students?
okay, yeah, I'll try that. I am gonna, rather than use one search, I'm going to go to education source. I kind of, because I'm more familiar with the EBSCO interface, I go to that if I have an option. The databases are generally set to all go to this basic search. So, you know, you go to advanced search, or I suggest to go to advanced search. And there's probably a word that we could discover, or a phrase that will describe things like Grammarly, that are some type, I don't know, what assistive writing technology or something like that. But I'm going to do a search with it. And then as I'm looking at the results, I'll be trying to figure out, is there a term that will be more kind of broadly describing things like Grammarly rather than Grammarly specifically. And you said what was it with freshman English or?
Freshman English courses or intro English courses?
Yeah, I found Grammarly very useful when I was teaching. So I don't have anything. So I'm going to first just say, actually, there are probably not that many things with Grammarly. So I only get, so again, you'll see I put Grammarly in freshman English, got nothing. But if I just put Grammarly, I get 21. So this is a small enough result that I can look through these and see if any of these match what I want. And if any of them do, then I would look at the search terms. And also the default sort is by relevance. We could resort this to newest since you were interested. And you could actually do this search in dissertation, the dissertation database as well, and possibly find, because maybe somebody's written a dissertation or thesis about this. So you'll see, I don't know if, like, just say this one was like, you know, something that you wanted. You'll see it does not have a link to full text. And if you click on this, it'll either find it if it's in another database, or it will give you a link to interlibrary loan and you can get the article. But I'm going to click on the title to get the extended record. And this is dealing with Grammarly. They're calling it plagiarism detection, which isn't really the term that I'm looking for. They do have these other tools. So that's not really, again, what you want. Because I guess Grammarly has a plagiarism
I saw one
component.
at the top that was an automated writing evaluation.
So I don't know if this is what, you know, things like Grammarly are called. And actually, you know, I find it quite helpful to look up things in Wikipedia to get other search terms, you know. And so I don't know whether Wikipedia has an entry for automated writing evaluation, but they might. I'm sure they probably have one about Grammarly. And so I would look it up in Wikipedia, Grammarly, just to see what is it they call it? What do people call it? And then I have terms that I can take to the databases. You can, you know, either take note of this, or if you click on that, it's going to do a whole new search. And there's only 12 articles with this thing. But as you, you know, this is a way that I come up with search terms that that I didn't think of, that I wouldn't have known before. And does this seem to be talking about what you are looking for?
Yes.
So, and evidently, I don't know, that's a term that is being used. And let me see the other questions. Was that helpful to?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'll share the slides. Because certainly I think, those two articles I think would be very helpful, especially that one about the taxonomy of literature reviews. At least it works well with the way my mind thinks, because I like to understand the components of something, like because it's like a puzzle you're putting together. If you're not, I don't know if you all are familiar about Ulrichs, but I've found that that's one thing that a lot of people aren't as familiar with as what they ought to be, because we're not mentioning it to them. But if you go to the database list and then Ulrichs, because of course you're going to be wanting peer-reviewed articles, and you can put in the name of a journal. I wish I could remember what was in that search we just did. I'm going to put that in. So I never heard of this. So I want to know something about it, find out, if I'm going to put this in the dissertation, I want to understand what it's about. And I might have to get an ISSN number for it. Well, International Journal, here, the ISSN is probably the best thing, and it may not show up in Ulrichs. I don't know how, but if there's a journal that you're not familiar with, well, in this case, it didn't find it, so it wasn't helpful. But if there's a journal you're not familiar with and you want to find out something about it, whether it's peer-reviewed or if it was that one, a Journal of Computer-Based Instruction, you can get information about it that will tell. This one I don't think is peer-reviewed, but it is scholarly. So that's where you remember the Ulrichs database. And I think that's all that, are there any other questions that you might have? I think I'm going to stop the sharing. Any other questions? Well, we're all, Fatima and myself and Amy are all here, ready to help you. We're on we'll be on the end of the chat button if you click on that, or you'll find our personal emails addresses on the library homepage, and we are also in the libraries waiting. And so by all means, let us help you if you have any questions in the future. And that, I think, is all